Textual criticism is the art and science of reconstructing the original text of a document from imperfect copies. To my reading, this study has reached a point where it's more science than art, but there's still a substantial amount of art in the process. As with any process that is the result of deep study, there are controversies over how to best do this. In regard to many texts, these controversies are fairly benign. When you have 5 or 6 editions of a text that date to before the invention of the printing press, you can more or less pick one as your base text and check things that don't make sense in it against the other copies. In something like a biblical book, Euclid's Elements, or Aristotle's Organon, where there are hundreds or even thousands of manuscripts, fragments, quotations, and commentaries, it gets a lot more complicated figuring out how to weigh the various textual variants. Every textual critic has a unique take on at least one text of the New Testament. Sometimes these aren't even textual. A text critic may see a variant in an obscure manuscript or translation, and even though they don't think it's original, it shows them something about the way an early reader understood the text, and this changes their understanding. One of the things that a lot of text critics have been quick to point out is that no major school of textual criticism severely impacts any major doctrine of the Christian faith. Even though a favorite passage for a particular point may not hold up to scrutiny when text criticism is applied, other texts that do support that doctrine will. I am not a text critic, not even an amateur. I have not put the necessary effort into studying the ancient manuscripts, their families, scribal habits, and translations. I am an amateur Bible translator, though, and with that in mind, it serves me well to be acquainted with the basic principles and concepts behind textual criticism to at least the degree that it makes it possible to sniff out the crazies. Along the way, I've gotten a feel for which families of New Testament textual criticism methodology I find most convincing and why. As I've said, this isn't a field that I study extensively, so if you prefer to go with the scholastic majority, I understand. But I've got a gap in my blog schedule and I need to clear these thoughts out of my head, so here they are. I'm going to group families of thought about New Testament textual criticism into 4 very large groups. I've already said that every text critic has a unique view on at least one reading, so there's no way I can capture that level of nuance with this kind of grouping. It's inevitable that some text critics are going to fall between 2 or 3 groups that I have here. That's fine. The only way for me to get more precise would be to do an individual evaluation of each textual critic. Don't view these as different rooms in a building, but as 4 tables to draw from at the buffet. Almost everyone is going to take something from each table, but a lot of people are going to take mostly from one table. Non-Greek source. I have to list this first because I do it in 3 cases: the Gospel of Matthew, the letters of Paul, and 1 Peter. This is also by far the most minority view. That said, no one completely ignores non-Greek versions of the New Testament. The most common version of this in America today is King James onlyism. In the Middle Ages, there was a similar movement supporting the Latin Vulgate that hasn't completely died out. I am connected with a few groups that prefer a Semitic source for the New Testament, even though I don't follow their logic for the whole New Testament. Obviously, I can't just say that everyone in this group is crazy. At least, not without admitting that I'm crazy. I do have to admit that those of us that take a non-Greek source for any part of the New Testament are in the minority and get even more minority the further up the education ladder you get. There's a bunch of us with a bunch of sources at the lay level, fewer with relevant bachelor's degrees, fewer with master's degrees, fewer still with doctorates. That's one of the big reasons I'm more than a little hesitant to just grab a Peshitta for most of the New Testament. But my full reasons for that are going to have to wait for another day. Non-Hortian Source. I struggle with a good name for most of these. A more typical name to put here is critical source. I don't like that because all the groups of thought put critical thinking to work. However, there's a particular brand of thinking that was codified by Fenton Hort. The guidelines of these systems have a particular way of grouping families of New Testament manuscripts. The most distinctive aspect of this family of thinking is the idea that the oldest manuscripts and fragments are probably closer to the original text, and the original text is all that we are trying to restore. Those that follow me closely are going to be surprised to hear me say that I actually believe that the methods used in this thought process might bring us closer to the original text of the New Testament books than other systems. However, even with that said, I don't prefer to use a Hortian-style text as my primary text for the New Testament. Non-Hortian Source. Once again, I struggle with names here. What I'm putting in this category goes by a variety of names: the Byzantine text type, majority text type, traditional text type, etc. This style actually has more in common with the thought process of Hort in that it groups text into families and promotes, or diminishes them based on criteria. The difference is the criteria. While Hort and his intellectual heirs prefer the small number of manuscripts that are oldest, this style prefers the readings with the widest distribution. With just that difference, you can quickly see that neither of these are crazy on the face of it. Most commonly, the oldest reading is preserved only in manuscripts from the arid climate of Egypt, so it could be that only Egypt ever knew those unique readings. Even though some of the Byzantine/majority readings don't show up until much later, the fact that they appear in Italy, Byzantium, and Syria suggests that they had to have come from a time when all those streams were joined. I tend to prefer this style in part because my view of inspiration is different from some people. I think that inspiration includes not only the initial writing of the text, but also the collection, use, and adaptation of the text by the generations that follow. Because of this, I'm perfectly willing to say that I think the Hortian style produces a text that is closer to the first few generations of the text, and that the non-Hortian style produces something closer to the inspired ideal. Textus-Receptus. This is the one where I'm using the most visible name. It's actually a brand name, as much as it's anything. This is the school of thought that says the Reformers or some other medieval group of theologians must have had the right text. This can range from a very serious text-critical analysis coupled with a theological evaluation to, "But when I was little, this was the Bible, so it just feels right." I'm actually not one to quickly and carelessly dismiss the thought sense that something just feels right. That feeling could be divine in origin. I would even say that is what drives me towards the non-Hortian style of Greek New Testament. Regardless of what's original, these are the texts that felt right to people over and over again in the most places across the most time. Therein lies the problem with the Textus-Receptus for me, though. It feels right, here and now, but only here and only now. I don't want to overprivilege local voices when I happen to know that the majority of voices say different, they're just further away. Conclusion. I am one of those that says that the stated goal of text criticism, to restore the original text, is a fool's errand. But since I'm saying something very close to it can't be done, I also see my job as getting out of the way of those that are doing it. There is a view of inspiration that sees the text as laid down one time for all people to look at and copy, but I'm not compelled by that view. Then there is the view that the text was passed among the community and improved over the first few generations. That's the view that I take. This idea can be taken too far, though. In the end, I think that the text God intended us to have is the text that was improved through circulation. I've been very compelled by the research and findings of Dr. Robinson, that the habits and findings of scribes suggest that the wide distribution of readings across the Christian world that are most common are most likely the readings that were most common early. Dr. Heiser has compiled data that strongly suggests the Old Testament was edited during transmission to better reflect true theology, and I think the same applies to the New Testament. This makes me less inclined to find the original text, and more interested in the settled stable text of the New Testament. For these reasons, the non-Hortian or Byzantine or majority text style is the one I'm most interested in.